I hope in this year, as we think about what it means to share our faith, we can be a little bit more courageous in sharing what we believe. I was really touched when someone talked about how in the last year when we focused on prayer, he felt it had made a difference in his life that he could actually speak words to a fellow coworker, for instance, with more comfort, to be able to say, "I'm praying for you." Those were words that felt too fundamentalist or something to him before. But once he found the words, it was like a coming out. It was a relief to be able to be his whole self in public. And just this week, we have an opportunity that you can read about in our bulletin about the United Church of Christ new ad campaign that's coming out, that they're doing a video ad online. And you can click on the link, and all you have to do is forward the email if you desire to share the good news. But it still is striking to me that if so many others in history and around the world have risked death and disobeyed totalitarian governments to practice their faith, why is it that we sometimes are so reluctant just to get out of bed on a Sunday morning and go to church? And why are we so reluctant to share our faith stories? I understand that we often disagree with one another politically. It's a free country. But sometimes we silence ourselves, I think, for social reasons when we might be really called to speak up. Our ancestors fought and died so that we could talk of our beliefs to one another. So I hope we exercise that right. I know you men in men's fellowship do that on Saturday mornings without starting a food fight, most weeks at least. If nothing else, we need to stand up for those who are excluded or persecuted, those who become fodder for tasteless jokes. If nothing else, to set a good example for our children. When we think of that poor student up in Massachusetts who was bullied so severely that she killed herself, we must never let that happen here on our watch as the Church of Jesus Christ bearing love to Brookfield. I encourage us all to find our own voices, to stand up for the love of Jesus and the power of amazing grace, especially in the face of angry fundamentalism that would insist on a very strict and unchristian legalism, whether it's in the name of Allah or the name of Christ. Although our expected anti-gay protesters didn't arrive in March last month, we can be very proud, I think, of our Brookfield High School students for organizing a counter-protest to protect the cast and crew of the Laramie Project. In a world where self-righteous voices try to drown each other out from both the left and the right, let us follow our heritage and try to listen for God's true voice, the still speaking voice that is always full of love and not of hate. As Peter said to the Sanhedrin, that is the voice we must obey. We must obey God rather than any human authority. And Jesus makes that clear when he calls us to discipleship, that we are called to practice loving kindness and work for justice in the world, as our women's mission trip did this winter when they helped the homeless poor in Rhode Island, or as some of our youth will do this spring break when they go to feed the poorest of the poor in Oaxaca, Mexico, or as our senior youth fellowship will do this summer when they travel out west to help Native Americans on the reservation in South Dakota. Christians of every denomination and every political persuasion are all called to holy disobedience against the principalities and powers of this world when they would happily neglect or even persecute those precious children God considers precious. The blind, the lame, the stranger, the outcast, the poor, the hungry, the sick, the prisoner, the widow, the orphan. If there's ever any question in our minds about which political leader is right or which political leader to follow, I think we could listen to the very good advice of Gamaliel in his case before the Sanhedrin when he says, If this plan or this undertaking is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. If we Christians could just follow this advice, we wouldn't need to waste so much energy fighting each other. The final judgment on any proposal or plan or political agenda, just as the fate of any church, is ultimately in God's hands. And although we may suffer persecution or even death for our holy disobedience to the greed and self-righteousness of earthly and human authorities, we know we can trust in the Lord who has called us. We can rest in the promise of our faith because God is so good and God's steadfast love endures forever. Thanks be to God for this good news. Amen.